The darkness within St. Jude's perpetual hope was not the restful absence of light. It was a heavy, smothering presence, thick with the scent of drowned lilies and the metallic tang of river mud that had curdled in the stagnant water. Elias, a boy of 11 years, huddled on the third tier of the elevated oak pulpit, a space that afforded him a precarious but necessary refuge above the invading floodwaters. The water, cold and utterly unforgiving, lapped just inches below the edge of the pulpit's base, creating a rhythmic, sickening slosh hiss sound that was the only constant percussion in this new, submerged world. It had been nearly 40 hours since the cresting of the Seraph River had violently annexed the town of Etheria, stripping the structures of their dignity and their inhabitants of their footing. Elias knew with a chilling certainty that settled deep in his bones that this vast, echoing space was now his whole universe. The perspective from the pulpit was dizzying. Below him, the nave, usually an expanse of worn, polished tile, was a menacing, murky lake. The water level was high enough to engulf the first 3 rows of pews entirely, their carved backs showing only as dark, angular shapes beneath the ruffled, unsettling surface. Higher still, the mahogany railing of the altar disappeared halfway, suggesting the terrifying depth of the intrusion. Elias's gaze traced the perimeter of the church, drawn by the faint, diffused light filtering through the massive, fractured stained glass windows, depicting the ascension of saints. The glass, cracked by the immense pressure of the storm's wind, transmitted the daylight in warped, watery streaks, crimson and sapphire reflections that danced across the surface of the flood like dying embers. His own body was a catalogue of low-level suffering. The chill had become an intrinsic part of his being, a low-grade ache that settled in his joints and refused to dissipate. His stomach cramped with the sharp, insistent hunger that had begun hours ago, but which now felt dull and resigned. He shifted slightly, attempting to alleviate the abrasive discomfort where the rough-hewn oak pressed into the back of his exposed thighs. His shirt, once a faded blue, was now stiff with dried silt and damp in patches where the mist rose from the water. He was focused, in that hyper-alert state unique to prolonged trauma, on the minutiae of the water's movement. It was not static. Though the worst of the storm had passed, the river outside still exerted a massive, invisible pressure, causing a slow, almost imperceptible current to sweep through the wide central aisle of the submerged nave. Elias watched the debris. It was a mournful procession. Earlier, it had been recognizable household detritus, a chipped ceramic plate, a splintered chair leg, a child's red rubber boot, each item a painful echo of the life that had existed before the water came. Now the objects were fewer, heavier, and darker, saturated entirely by the surrounding element. He had been watching a particularly heavy section of waterlogged hymn book circling the base of the lectern for perhaps an hour, tracking its slow, agonizing orbit. The monotony was a heavy, emotional weight, pressing down on the urgency that still flickered within him, the frantic, desperate need to know what had become of his parents. The question that hung in the air like the oppressive humidity. Then the current shifted subtly, drawing his attention sharply away from the orbiting hymn book. A new object had entered the periphery of his sight, drifting in from the darkest recess of the flooded south transept, the area near the confessionals, where the light struggled to penetrate even at midday. It was not large, perhaps the size of a man's forearm, but its shape was distinct, refusing to blend into the random cluster of sticks and leaves that accompanied it. Elias instinctively leaned forward, resting his forearms on the dusty railing of the pulpit. The movement sent a fresh wave of dizziness through him, and he had to clench his jaw against a sharp, internal nausea. He remained fixed, his eyes narrowed, attempting to pierce the gloom and the reflective shimmer of the water's surface. The object moved with an unsettling deliberation, borne not by turbulent motion, but by the relentless, slow pull of the hidden undertow. It was moving, gradually but definitively, towards the main body of the nave, directly towards his precarious sanctuary. The light was poor, and the water was turbid, thick with suspended earth, making definitive identification impossible. He registered only a specific tonal quality. The object was dark, darker than the brown mud, darker than the sodden wood, and possessed an unusual density. It seemed to ride slightly lower in the water than the typical floating would, suggesting either heavy saturation or an inherent weight. The slow nature of its approach intensified the dread. In a moment of sheer, frantic crisis, fear is sharp and immediate. But this was an agonizing, drawn-out revelation. Each foot the object covered demanded several minutes of intense, silent scrutiny. Elias found himself holding his breath, a habit born of wanting to silence the frantic beat of his own heart, which seemed far too loud in the stillness of the ruined sanctuary. He could taste the dry, dusty air on his tongue, a faint ghost of the church's usual scent of beeswax and old paper, now tragically overwhelmed by the smell of decay. He watched the object rotate slightly as it navigated the submerged corner of a broken pew. As it turned, a specific, recognizable color caught the meager light. A deep, profound crimson. It was a color that belonged not to nature, not to the mud or the water, but to human intention. The color flashed and vanished as the object rotated again. Elias felt a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline, a dizzying, momentary lift of energy that warred with his profound exhaustion. This surge was rooted in a memory, vague and indistinct, but intensely warm, associated specifically with that exact shade of dark red. He tracked its trajectory as it slid past the smooth, water-worn statue base of St. Jude himself, the patron saint of hopeless causes, now ironically submerged up to his marble shoulders. The object was perhaps 20 feet away now, approaching the wider, calmer stretch of the aisle. The crimson reappeared, this time sustained for a full second, and Elias's breath hitched in his throat. It was not merely a spot of paint, it was a small, intricately carved detail, wet and shining faintly. He strained forward, ignoring the cold sweat that had broken out on his forehead. The object was a small, oblong wooden box, heavily lacquered, or perhaps just saturated with water. But what defined it? What made Elias's vision blur slightly with an instantaneous wave of recognition and despair was the unique carving affixed to its upper edge. It was a small sparrow, carved from the same dark wood, stained entirely in that rich, unmistakable crimson dye. Elias had known that sparrow since he was old enough to remember objects. It had been carved by his father, Daniel, years ago, intended to be the final piece attached to a specific, treasured artifact, the journal belonging to his mother, Clara. The journal was not merely a collection of writings. It was Clara's detailed chronicle of Elias's early childhood, a record of every tooth lost, every clumsy drawing, every fever endured. Daniel had fixed the crimson sparrow to the journal's front cover, a piece of dark, aged leather, as a symbol of resilience and vigilance, believing the bird represented the hopeful flight of memory. Elias knew, with the sickening certainty of a sudden blow to the chest, that the small wooden box floating towards him was that journal. It had shed its leather cover in the brutality of the flood, or perhaps the leather had simply disintegrated from water saturation, leaving the core wooden structure, a stiffened interior lining, heavy with the weight of the water and its contents, still held together by the strong adhesive where the carved sparrow was fixed. The journal floated low, almost completely submerged, only the top curvature of the waterlogged wood and the distinctive crimson sparrow visible above the murky surface. The realization did not arrive as a gentle wave of melancholy. It was a physical detonation within the boy's chest. It was the absolute, undeniable proof of intrusion, a fragment of his former life ripped violently from its moorings and delivered back to him by the same cruel force that had stolen everything else. A harsh, involuntary gasp escaped Elias's lips. Raw and sharp, against the immense silence of the church, the sound startled him. His control, the rigid, exhausted control he had maintained for nearly 2 days, attempting to remain a silent observer, vanished instantly. His muscles seized. The energy that had sprung from the recognition was instantly metabolized into a terrible gravitational weight that rooted him to the spot. Even as his mind screamed at him to reach for the object, the journal drifted closer, now perhaps 12 feet away, caught temporarily in a small eddy created by the partially submerged railing of the communion rail. Elias watched the crimson sparrow bob gently, the motion terribly serene against the chaos it represented. The meticulous detail of the carving, the tiny grooves meant to denote feathers, the sharp point of the beak, was perfectly preserved, untouched by the flood's abrasive violence, as if mocking the destruction around it. He tried to stand, to descend the rough steps of the pulpit, which were thankfully still dry, but his legs refused. They felt less like limbs and more like twin columns of lead, vibrating uncontrollably with a tremor that began deep in his femoral muscles. The visual presence of the sparrow, the tangible, immediate proof that the water had been there, in their home, had touched and defiled the most intimate objects of his mother's life, short-circuited his ability to function. His balance failed him. It was not a conscious decision to move, but a sudden, catastrophic collapse of core muscular strength. Elias dropped to his knees. The sound of his knees hitting the dusty, splintered oak floor of the pulpit was sharp, echoing loudly in the immense, cavernous space, a small, distinct clap of finality. He barely registered the pain in his kneecaps. The emotional impact was too massive, too overwhelming to allow for minor physical sensation. He remained there, perched on his knees, his hands gripping the edge of the pulpit railing so tightly that the skin over his knuckles turned white and taut. His forehead pressed against the railing, his view of the floating journal now obscured by the sheer proximity of the wood. A sound, involuntary and ragged, tore from his throat. It was not a cry of fear, but a mournful, guttural noise. The sound of an internal dam breaking under impossible pressure. Tears, hot and sharp, instantly welled in his eyes, blurring the outlines of the dark, imposing sanctuary. He hadn't cried in the 40 hours since the sirens began to wail. Fear had held the tears back, prioritizing survival, but this object, this small, waterlogged piece of wood, bypassed the fear entirely and went straight to the core of his loss. It was his mother's voice floating towards him, encased in a coffin of her own making, delivered by the destructive force that had taken her. The terror of the flood, the generalized anxiety of being alone, was replaced by a sharper, more focused agony, the specific, devastating knowledge of what was gone. The journal was the physical record of his life with her, and now it was floating, ruined, alien, utterly detached from the warmth and safety it once represented. Elias slowly lifted his head, the movement requiring enormous muscular effort, as if gravity had increased tenfold. He blinked furiously, struggling to clear the moisture from his vision. The crimson sparrow was now agonizingly close, caught just 3 feet from the base of the pulpit, rotating slowly in the water. He could see the saturated grain of the wood beneath the lacquer, the deep, dark stain of the water permeating the fibers of the once smooth object. He stared, his eyes wide and unblinking, tracing the familiar lines of the carving. He remembered watching his father work on it in the dim light of the garage, the smell of wood shavings and oil, the meticulous concentration Daniel had brought to the task. A single memory flashed through the overwhelming pain. Clara, his mother, sitting by the window in the afternoon sun, the journal open in her lap, the crimson sparrow glinting, her hand resting on the page as she paused to watch Elias playing in the yard. The memory was vivid, tactile, and instantly shattered by the sight of the object in the filthy water. He released his grip on the railing and his hands dropped heavily to the dusty floor. The dust adhered instantly to the moisture on his skin. He needed to reach it. The impulse was primal, desperate, an illogical need to rescue this piece of her, even though he knew instinctively it was already irreparably ruined. He began to crawl forward on his knees, ignoring the sharp slivers of dry oak that dug into the thin material of his trousers. The distance between his position and the edge of the platform felt vast, insurmountable. His movements were jerky, uncoordinated, driven solely by the emotional imperative. When he reached the very edge of the pulpit platform, his face was mere inches from the murky surface of the water. The smell rose to meet him, a choking blend of sewage, sulphurous decay, and wet earth. He recoiled slightly, but the object held him captive. The current had paused its relentless march. The journal, with its crimson marker, was bobbing gently in the absolute silence directly in front of him. He stretched his hand out, slowly, cautiously, not wanting to disturb the fragile balance of the object, nor risk his own stability. If he slipped, the sheer momentum of his tired, weakened body would plunge him into the freezing water. His fingers, trembling uncontrollably, brushed the surface of the water, sending tiny ripples outwards. The coldness was shocking, instantly numbing. He paused, gathering the last shreds of his focus. He reached again, moving deliberately, forcing the tremor in his arm into submission. His fingertips finally made contact with the wet, cool wood of the journal's remains, just below the sparrow carving. The moment of contact was electric, a sudden, sharp circuit completing itself. It felt heavy, much heavier than a piece of waterlogged wood should feel, dense with the history it contained. Elias carefully, agonizingly, slowly drew the journal towards him. He could not lift it out of the water quickly. The sudden shift might destabilize him. He dragged it along the surface, guiding it until it rested against the vertical face of the pulpit platform, right beneath his trembling hands. It took him several minutes of shallow, panting breaths to achieve the next step. He had to lean far over the edge, balancing his weight on his elbows, which pressed painfully into the dry oak. With both hands now firmly gripping the ruined object, he carefully pulled it upwards over the lip of the platform. The saturated wood dragged against the oak, a grating sound that seemed deafening. He managed to lift it high enough for it to flop heavily onto the dry wood of the pulpit floor. Elias immediately retracted his hands, sitting back heavily on his heels. He stared down at the rescued object. It was worse than he had imagined. The small wooden framework, which had held the leather cover and the pages, was swollen to nearly twice its original size. The crimson sparrow was still fixed firmly, but the wood beneath it was black with absorbed water. The edges of the journal's remaining structure were soft and pulpy. The defining horror, however, was what had occurred to the pages inside. The journal had not been tightly bound. It had been a loose-leaf structure reinforced by the heavy leather cover, designed to allow his mother to easily replace or add pages. The water, the violent churning of the flood, had penetrated every fiber. The pages were no longer distinguishable sheets. They were a solid, gelatinous block of soaked grey pulp. The ink bled entirely, the handwriting dissolving into an illegible marbled swirl of charcoal grey and brown sludge. His mother's voice. The chronicle of his early life was gone. The memories had liquefied, rendering the object a heavy, meaningless artifact of wood and slurry. Elias reached out a single finger, hesitantly, and touched the thick, cold mass of paper. The texture was horrifyingly smooth, like raw dough or wet clay. As his finger made the slightest depression, a small amount of murky water squeezed out. instantly soaking the dry wood of the pulpit beneath. He pulled his hand back, staring at the filth on his fingertip. The profound finality of the destruction was paralyzing. This wasn't just physical damage, it was the obliteration of history, the erasure of proof. He felt the intense, sharp sting of fresh tears again, but they were different now. They were not born of generalized fear or sorrow, but of an acute, focused grief for this specific annihilated item. Elias lowered his head again, pressing his tear-streaked cheek against the cold, wet wood of the object itself. He inhaled deeply, searching, desperately searching for any trace of her scent, the faintest ghost of vanilla or the sharp, clean smell of paper. There was nothing but the overwhelming stench of the river and the decay of the inundated church. He remained motionless for what felt like an eternity, the wetness of the wood chilling his skin, the sheer weight of the object pressing down on the small space of his temporary sanctuary. His entire body shook now, a full-body tremble that exhaustion, cold and terror had finally managed to induce. Slowly, carefully, his fingers began to trace the outlines of the carved crimson sparrow. He moved with the reverence of someone touching a sacred relic, acutely aware that this small bird was the last perfect remnant of his parents' collaborative love. The hands that carved it, and the memories it was meant to protect, the act of tracing the carving shifted the object slightly. As it moved, Elias noticed a minute detail he had previously missed, tucked into the dark crevice where the sparrow met the main body of the journal structure. The flood had done a terrible, comprehensive job, but not entirely perfect. Wedged deep into the seam, protected by the density of the surrounding wood and the overlap of the carving, was a tiny fragment of paper. It was not part of the pulpy mass. This fragment was small, perhaps a quarter of an inch wide, but it was stiff, almost waxy, and appeared to be a different, more durable material than the normal journal pages. With a sudden, frantic resurgence of hope, a dizzying, painful spike of irrational anticipation, Elias used the very tip of his thumb to gently, meticulously scrape away the wet mud and grime surrounding the fragment. The tension in his hands was so great that they felt like rigid claws. He worked with the concentration of a surgeon, fully aware that a single careless motion could obliterate this final minuscule clue. It took 5 agonizing minutes to free the edge of the paper. It was not wood, and it was not normal paper. It was a photograph treated with a thick, protective coating, almost like heavy parchment, though that protection had clearly been tested to its limit. He managed to pull it free. It was tiny, less than 2 inches square, and still utterly saturated, but the image, miraculously, was intact. The protective layer had swollen and curled at the edges, but the central emulsion had held. Elias carefully lifted the photograph to the dim, filtered light. His eyes, already strained from hours of searching the gloom, struggled to focus on the miniature image. The photo was a black-and-white snapshot, slightly faded with age, yet clear in its depiction. It showed a small family, 3 people, sitting on a weathered wooden bench in what Elias recognized instantly as the overgrown backyard of their house before the river had ever threatened the town. The man in the center, Daniel, his father, had his arm wrapped securely around the woman beside him, Clara, his mother. Both were smiling, their faces young and unlined by the anxieties that later plagued their town. But it was the small figure nestled between them that caused the breath to utterly leave Elias's body. It was him. A 2-year-old version of himself, hair bright in the sunlight, wearing a ridiculous too large pair of striped overalls, clutching a small stuffed toy, a faded floppy rabbit he had forgotten entirely. The tiny version of Elias was laughing, head thrown back in pure, unadulterated joy, blissfully ignorant of the coming tragedy. The vulnerability was unbearable. The image was proof of a happiness so complete, so simple, that it now felt like a cruel, impossible dream. It wasn't a document of his life, it was a captured moment of perfect, secure love. The sight of his 2-year-old self, protected and cherished between the two faces he now desperately longed to see, struck him with the force of a physical blow. The specific memory of the day the photo was taken, a picnic his mother had meticulously planned, the sweet, earthy taste of the homemade lemonade rushed into his mind, overwhelming the immediate reality of the cold, flooded church. He had survived the collapse of his world, the terror, the hunger. He had endured the generalized pain of being an orphan, alone. But this small square of paper, preserved by a miracle of timing and placement, broke the final barrier of his defenses. Elias's grip slackened. The photograph fluttered momentarily in his damp, trembling fingers. A fresh, more violent storm of grief tore through him. His chest contracted with agonizing force, robbing him of the ability to inhale deeply. The involuntary noise that erupted from him was not a simple sob, but a deep, tearing wail, a sound of profound, utter desolation that seemed to absorb the silence of the church and throw it back, magnified. He let the sodden, ruined journal fall back onto the pulpit floor with a soft, thudding sound entirely forgotten. His hands flew up to cover his face, trying desperately to contain the eruption of pain, as if he could smother the grief physically. He slid forward from his kneeling position, collapsing onto the dusty wood, his body contorted, arms wrapped tightly around his head. The immediate, urgent alert that had kept him functioning, the need for escape, the necessity of silence, vanished completely, replaced by the crushing weight of pure, unadulterated sorrow. He wept for the laughing boy in the picture, for the secure world that had vanished, and for the specific, tangible memory of their faces, now rendered brutally real by the photo. The intensity of the pain was physical. It felt like his ribs were compressing inwards, that his lungs refused the air he so desperately needed. He pressed his knuckles into his eyes until colorful flashes exploded behind his eyelids, trying to replace the image of the ruined, pulpy journal and the tiny, perfect photograph. He cried until his throat was raw and constricted, until his breathing became jagged and shallow, until his body was shaking not from cold, but from the violent spasms of pure emotional exhaustion. Minutes bled into hours in that ruined position. The light outside shifted, turning the sapphire streaks of the stained glass into a deep indigo, signaling the slow, inevitable approach of night. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the worst of the emotional deluge began to recede, leaving him spent, his eyes swollen and stinging, his entire body limp. He lay there, belly down on the dusty oak, his cheek pressed against the rough, cold wood. The silence of the church returned, but it was a heavier, more intimate silence now, having witnessed his collapse. He could feel the small, stiff square of the photograph resting beneath his chest, where it had fallen. The weight was negligible, but its presence felt monumental. Elias reached for it again, his movements now slow and methodical, drained of the manic urgency that had defined the preceding hours. He carefully retrieved the photograph. He lifted it and held it steady in the last vestiges of the fading light. He stared at his 2-year-old self and at his parents, fixed forever in that moment of uncomplicated happiness. A strange, quiet clarity began to form in the aftermath of the emotional violence. The photograph was a testament. It was proof that the happiness was real, that the love had existed, and that he was the result of that love. The flood had taken the record of his life, but it had failed to extinguish the evidence of his existence within their love. The water could destroy the ink, but it could not wash away the memory that the image triggered. Elias carefully brought the tiny picture to his mouth and pressed a dry, chapped kiss to the center, right where his mother's face was captured. The paper was still damp and cool. He knew he could not keep it exposed. The remaining light was too dim, and the material was too fragile. He forced himself to sit up, dragging his heavy, exhausted limbs into a cross-legged position. He looked down at the ruined journal lying beside him. It was a failure, a monument to loss, but it was also the vessel that had carried this single, crucial piece of salvage. He needed a safe place for the photograph, somewhere warm, dry, and entirely secure. He reached into the front pocket of his trousers. It was still damp, but mostly empty. He pulled out the only object he possessed, a small, smooth river stone, worn perfectly round, which his mother had given him weeks ago, saying it was a good luck stone for smooth passages. He had carried it religiously. He hesitated for only a moment. The stone had been given for good luck, but the love in the photograph was more potent than any talisman. He gently placed the photograph into the damp pocket, pushing it carefully into the corner, ensuring the edges were not curled or bent. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he took the smooth, lucky stone and tossed it without ceremony into the murky flood waters below. The stone sank immediately, disappearing with a soft plop that barely disturbed the water's surface. He was trading abstract luck for concrete memory. Now he looked at the waterlogged journal again. He knew he could not carry the heavy, pulpy mass, but the crimson sparrow was still fixed to the wood. It was small enough and too significant to abandon. He searched the surrounding pulpit floor with his eyes, seeking a tool. The only object within reach was a splintered piece of oak broken off the decorative railing during the storm's fury. It was thin and sharp at one end. Elias picked up the piece of wood. His hands were steadier now, energized by a grim, focused determination that had replaced the paralyzing grief. He knelt again beside the journal and began the meticulous, slow process of separating the crimson sparrow carving from the main body of the pulpy, swollen journal structure. He used the sharp edge of the splintered oak to carefully pry beneath the edges of the carving, applying minute amounts of pressure, working patiently around the dense, water-swollen wood. The adhesive was strong, designed by his father to be permanent. It took him nearly 15 minutes, every second demanding absolute focus to prevent the splintered tool from slipping and damaging the fragile carving. Sweat beaded on his forehead again, not from exertion, but from the immense tension of the task. Finally, with a soft, tearing rip sound, the adhesive gave way on the last corner. The crimson sparrow, still perfectly carved and entirely saturated, came free in Elias's hand. He discarded the splintered oak and the large, pulpy mass of the ruined journal, pushing the latter away from the edge of the pulpit. He would not look at it again. He held the sparrow carving close. It was cool and smooth, the deep crimson still recognizable even in the rapidly failing light. It fit neatly into the palm of his hand. Elias remained sitting on the elevated pulpit, the small, specific weight of the carved bird in one hand, and the precious, small photograph resting against his skin in his pocket. The tears were gone, replaced by a dull, aching emptiness. But the profound sense of hopelessness that had consumed him upon the journal's discovery had been replaced by a fragile yet undeniable resolve. He was alone. Yes, the world was destroyed, but he carried within him two small, tangible proofs of the life that was and the love that endured. The flood had delivered his sorrow, but in doing so, it had also delivered his motivation. The church was completely silent now, save for the persistent, gentle slosh hiss of the water below and the slow, steady beat of Elias's own heart. He took a long, shuddering breath, filling his lungs completely, accepting the heavy, damp air. He lifted the crimson sparrow to his lips, kissed its cold, carved wood, and then tucked it carefully into the secure inner lining of his damp shirt. Right over his sternum, he stood up slowly, testing his leaden legs. They held. He looked out over the flooded nave, the dark water reflecting the distant indigo of the fractured stained glass. The urgency of alert returned, But now it was tempered with purpose. He was still hiding, still vulnerable, but no longer merely waiting to die. He was carrying his family with him. He had dropped to his knees in agony, but he rose with the absolute, definitive knowledge of why he had to survive. The weight of his memory was immense, but it was the only weight he truly needed to bear. The long, terrifying night had just begun, but Elias faced the gloom, pressing the tiny weight of the crimson sparrow against his heart, a solitary, vulnerable figure in the vast, ruined sanctuary of St. Jude's perpetual hope.